영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Les Misérables, Chapter 1, A Suspicious Man. An hour before sunset in October 1815, a man traveling on foot entered a little town in France. The few people who were at their windows at that hour nervously watched this wretched-looking traveler. He wore a coarse yellow shirt, blue trousers with holes in the knees, and a ragged gray smock that was patched with green cloth sewed with twine. His hair was short, and his beard was long. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, although it was difficult to tell because a leather cap hid part of his sweaty, dusty face. The man must have been walking all day because he appeared very weary. When he reached the center of town, he walked toward the mayor's office. He went in, and 15 minutes later, he came out. The stranger made his way toward the inn and entered the kitchen. The innkeeper was busy preparing a huge dinner in the fireplace. Hearing the door open and a newcomer enter, the innkeeper asked, without raising his eyes, "What does monsieur want?" "Something to eat and a place to stay." "Nothing is easier." The innkeeper looked up and started to smile, but then he saw his ragged guest. "For pay?" The man drew a large leather purse from his pocket. "I have money." "Then I am at your service. Have a seat." While the stranger waited for his dinner, the innkeeper scribbled a note and handed it to a boy. He whispered something to the child, who ran off. In a few minutes, the boy returned and showed a scrap of paper to the innkeeper. The innkeeper went over to the stranger, who was sitting by the fire. "Is dinner ready?" asked the man. "Get out," the innkeeper whispered in his ear. "I was suspicious when you arrived, so I sent a message to the mayor's office. I know you're Jean Valjean, and I also know what you are." The stranger bowed his head, picked up his knapsack, and went outside. He walked through the town, stopping to ask for food and lodgings at a tavern and a house, but no one would let him in. The weary man even tried the prison. "A prison isn't a tavern," said the guard at the door. "Get yourself arrested and we'll open the door for you." It was now dark, and the exhausted stranger lay on a stone bench in front of the church. Just then, an old woman emerged from the church. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Can't you see I'm going to sleep?" he said angrily. "You can't sleep there. Have you tried the inn?" "I don't have enough money for the inn," Valjean lied. "I've knocked on every door and everybody has driven me away." The woman handed him 4 coins. "Take these and knock on that door over there." She pointed to a small house next to the church. Bishop Myriel lived there with his sister, Mademoiselle Baptistine, and their housekeeper, Madame Magloire. The bishop was famous for giving away most of his wealth to the poor. The only luxury he allowed himself was to keep some silver, a set of 6 plates, a ladle, and 2 candlesticks. There were no locks on his doors. While Madame Magloire was at the market, she heard that a dangerous man had arrived in town. "He's a dangerous beggar," she said breathlessly to Bishop Myriel as he sat before the fire with his sister. "Everyone is locking their doors, but we don't have locks, and you have the bad habit of saying 'come in' even at midnight and—" She chattered on about the dangerous man, but the bishop wasn't listening. Just then, there was a violent knock at the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened wide as if pushed by someone with great strength, and the stranger entered. Madame Magloire didn't dare to scream. Mademoiselle Baptistine sat trembling with her mouth open. Bishop Myriel looked calmly at the intruder. "My name is Jean Valjean and I'm a convict," blurted out the man. "I spent 19 years on the prison ships. 4 days ago I was set free, and I've walked 30 miles today. Can I stay here?" "Madame Magloire, set another place at the table," said the bishop. "Did you hear me? I'm a convict," said Valjean. "Here's my yellow identity card. That's enough to get me kicked out wherever I go. It says right here, this man is very dangerous. I must show it at the mayor's office in every town where I spend the night." "Monsieur, sit down," said the bishop. We'll eat shortly, and your bed will be made ready." Valjean could not believe that someone was treating him so kindly. He was soon eating from the silver plates with the bishop and Mademoiselle Baptistine. After dinner, the bishop showed him to a bed near the bishop's own bedroom. As they were passing through the bishop's room, Madame Magloire was putting away the silver in the cupboard behind the bed. "A good night's rest will make you feel better," said the bishop. "Thank you," said Valjean quietly, but then his voice turned harsh. "You let me sleep so close to you. How do you know I'm not a murderer?" The bishop just smiled and said, "Good night." Although Valjean had told the bishop that he was a convict, he hadn't told the whole story. He'd been born into a poor peasant family. After he grew up, he became a tree pruner like his father. Valjean's parents had died when he was very young. He had only one relative left, a sister who took him in. When her husband died, she had 7 children, ranging in age from 1 to 8. Valjean was then in his mid-20s and took his place as head of the household. He earned 18 sous a day during tree pruning season. After that season ended, he worked as a reaper, driver, or laborer. He did whatever work he could find. His sister also worked, but misery closed in on this sad family. There was a very severe winter. Valjean had no work, and the family had nothing to eat. Valjean broke into a bakery and stole a loaf of bread for the children. The baker ran after him and caught him. Valjean was arrested and sentenced to 5 years on a prison ship. He was dressed in a red smock, and his past life was erased, even his name. He was now a prisoner, number 24601. His 4 escape attempts lengthened his sentence to 19 years. He lost track of his family, although he later heard that his sister and 1 child had moved to Paris. There was one area where Valjean excelled in prison. He was stronger than the other inmates and could lift and hold enormous weights on his back. Jean Valjean had walked onto the prison ship sobbing and shuddering, but he left it hardened, physically, mentally, and spiritually. He was a very dangerous man indeed. Les Misérables, Chapter 2, The Thief. As the church clock struck 2, Jean Valjean awoke in the bishop's house. Many thoughts passed through his mind, but one kept returning. There was a small fortune in silver in the next room. The 6 plates and the ladle were worth twice what he had earned for 19 years of prison labor. Valjean sat on the edge of the bed, thinking about the silver for an hour. He might have remained there longer if the clock hadn't struck again. The clock seemed to say, "Let's go." So Valjean stood up and went to the door that led to the bishop's bedroom. The bishop had left it ajar. Valjean pushed the door lightly with his fingertip, and it opened a little wider. He waited a moment, and then pushed the door again, more boldly this time. The door opened wide with a loud creak. Valjean froze with his heart pounding. But no one in the house woke up. Valjean peered into the room and saw the bishop sleeping peacefully, a beam of moonlight illuminating his pale face. Valjean slipped silently into the room. He opened the cupboard at the head of the bed and removed the basket containing the ladle and plates. Once outside, he threw away the basket, ran across the garden, and leaped over the low white wall. The next morning, the bishop was walking in the garden when his housekeeper dashed out of the house. "The silver basket has disappeared!" cried Madame Magloire. "I just found it here in the garden." The bishop calmly handed the basket to her. "But there's nothing in it! That man who came last night must have stolen the silver!" Madame Magloire ran back into the bishop's house while he bent sadly over a flower lying on the ground. The basket had broken its stem. Madame Magloire came running into the garden again. "He's gone!" she said to the bishop. The bishop was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I held on to that silver for a long time when I should have given it to the poor. Our visitor was evidently a poor man, so it's appropriate that the silver now belongs to him." "But what are you going to eat from? We don't have any—" Their discussion was interrupted by the bishop's sister calling to them from a window. "Someone's knocking at the front door!" cried Mademoiselle Baptistine. Madame Magloire hurried into the house with the bishop following slowly behind her. "Come in," said the bishop when he reached the front room. The door opened, and there stood 3 policemen. One held Jean Valjean by his collar. "I'm so happy to see you again," the bishop said kindly to Valjean. "I meant for you to have my candlesticks too. Why didn't you take them along with your ladle and plates? They're also made of silver and will bring a good price." Valjean's eyes widened, and he looked at the bishop with a stunned expression. "He seemed to be running away from something," said one of the policemen. "So we stopped him and found your silver. And then I'm sure he told you that he'd spent the night here and that I'd given it to him. I hope you can see that you've made a terrible mistake." "If that's the truth, then we'll let him go," said the same policeman. "Let him go," said the bishop. Then he went to the mantel, picked up the 2 candlesticks, and handed them to Valjean. "Here are your candlesticks, my friend." Madame Magloire and Mademoiselle Baptistine were too amazed to speak. Valjean took the candlesticks with a wild look in his eye. "By the way, my friend," continued the bishop, "the next time you visit, you don't have to come through the garden. You can always come in by the front door. It's never locked." The policemen left, and the bishop turned his attention to Valjean again. In a quiet voice, he said, "Never forget that you've promised me to use this silver to become an honest man. Now, go in peace." Valjean knew that he hadn't promised the bishop anything, but he was too astonished to say a word. He fled from the bishop's house and the town as fast as he could. Valjean felt angry, but he wasn't sure with whom. He didn't know whether he should feel touched or humiliated by the bishop's actions. Perhaps he would be less agitated if the police had taken him to prison. At least he knew how to deal with prison. As the sun was setting, Valjean sat by the side of the road, only a few miles from the bishop's house. He had been wandering and thinking all day, without paying attention to where he was going. In a few minutes, a young chimney sweep came walking down the road. The boy was busy singing and tossing a handful of coins in the air. He had managed to catch them all on the back of his hand, until now. A silver 40-sou coin got away from him and rolled toward the man sitting by the road. Valjean promptly put his foot on top of it. The boy walked over to him and said, "Monsieur, give me my coin." "What's your name?" "Little Gervais." "Go away, little Gervais," said Valjean, looking at the ground. The boy repeated his request, and Valjean continued to look at the ground. Little Gervais tried to move the big, heavy-soled shoe that covered his treasure. The child began to cry, and Valjean looked up. "Are you still here?" Valjean said in a menacing voice. He stood up suddenly without moving his foot. "You'd better get going if you know what's good for you." The boy looked at him in terror before running away as fast as possible. A few minutes later, Valjean heard him sobbing, and then there was silence. Valjean continued to sit by the side of the road until it was dark. When he stood up again, he saw the coin. "What's this?" he said to himself, and then he remembered the chimney sweep. "I've done a bad thing. I must find that boy and return this to him." Valjean called the boy's name over and over again, but there was no response. He started to walk and soon met a priest on horseback. "Father, have you passed a boy on the road?" asked Valjean. "He's about 12 years old." "I've seen no one," said the priest. "Here," said Valjean, handing the priest a few coins. "Take these and give them to the poor in your parish." Then he added, "I'm a robber, and you should have me arrested." The priest fled in fear. For hours, Valjean kept searching for little Gervais. Suddenly his knees buckled and he fell to the ground. It was as if the weight of his guilty conscience had overwhelmed him. "What a wretch I am!" he exclaimed, and he burst into tears for the first time in 19 years. Valjean realized that he had to change. When the church clock chimed 3 on that morning, he was kneeling in prayer at the bishop's door. Les Misérables, Chapter 3, A Respectable Man. Two months later, after the robbery at the bishop's home, a stranger entered a small French city at dusk. Carrying a knapsack and a walking stick, he looked like a laborer. Just as he arrived in the city, a fire broke out in the city hall. The man rushed into the building and risked his life to save two children, the police chief's children. The stranger did not show his yellow identity card, and in the confusion surrounding the fire, no one asked him for it. And that is how Jean Valjean started a new life in a new city with a new name, Monsieur Madeleine. The city had once been famous for a special kind of black jewelry, but the jewelry industry had fallen on hard times. Madeleine, however, soon discovered a way to make the jewelry more cheaply. Everyone benefited from this new manufacturing process. The factories made more money, the factory workers' wages went up, and consumers paid less. As for Madeleine, he built a large factory with separate workshops for men and women. He required that all his employees be honest and of good moral character. By 1820, he had made a fortune and deposited more than 600,000 francs in the bank. But before doing that, he spent more than 1,000,000 francs on the city and its poor. He improved the hospital and replaced the miserable schoolhouse with 2 new schools, one for boys and one for girls. People begged him to become the mayor, but Madeleine refused, and nothing could persuade him to change his mind. Then one day, an old woman called out to him as he passed her doorstep. "A good mayor is a good thing. Are you afraid of the good you can do?" Her words struck him, and soon he was Mayor Madeleine. Nevertheless, he continued to live simply. He fulfilled his duties as mayor, but led an isolated life beyond that. Although he was no longer young, he was still very strong, and was always willing to lend a hand to anyone who needed help. Whenever he went out, his pockets were full of money, but when he returned, they were empty, because he had given it all away. The mayor was especially kind to chimney sweeps, who passed through the city looking for work. He always asked their names and handed them money. Mayor Madeleine was a pleasant man, but there was something sad about him. People saw him as a rich man who was not proud, a fortunate man who did not appear content. At the beginning of 1821, the local newspaper reported the death of Bishop Myriel. The next morning when the mayor went out, he was dressed all in black. Everyone wondered why he was mourning the death of the bishop. "You must be a relative of the bishop's," one elderly woman said to him. "No, madame," he replied respectfully. "Then why do you wear mourning for him?" "In my youth, I was a servant for his family." "Ah!" The woman seemed satisfied with his explanation, and no one else questioned him. Time passed, and everyone grew to respect the mayor. People came from 30 miles around to consult him. Mayor Madeleine settled differences, prevented lawsuits, and reconciled enemies. He seemed to have a sense of what was good and fair, a natural understanding of the law. There was, however, one man who held himself apart and refused to be drawn into admiring the mayor. His name was Javert, and he was an inspector in the police department. Often when the mayor passed along the street, acknowledging the greetings of his followers, Javert stood alone watching him. "I know I've seen that man somewhere before," Javert said to himself. "But where?" Javert had been born in a prison. His mother was a fortune-teller, and his father was a convict on a prison ship. In his youth, Javert worked as a guard on a prison ship. He had great respect for authority, but he had nothing but disgust for anyone who broke the law. Harsh and judgmental, he made no exceptions. Javert would have arrested his own father for escaping from prison. Javert's role in life was to be a spy and an informer. Javert always kept an eye on Madeleine, an eye full of suspicion and speculation. The mayor endured this unpleasant and annoying stare without appearing to pay any attention to it. He treated Javert as he treated everyone else, with kindness and a friendly manner. One morning, the mayor was walking along one of the back alleys when he heard shouting and saw a crowd gathering. A horse had been pulling a cart when it stumbled and fell. In trying to help the horse, its owner, an old man named Fauchelevent, had fallen under the cart. The cart was heavily loaded, so there was no way to pull the man out. "Help!" cried Fauchelevent. "I'm being crushed to death!" Mayor Madeleine approached and the crowd parted. He quickly saw that the only way to free the old man was to lift the cart. "Does anybody have a jack?" he asked. "Someone has gone to fetch one," replied a peasant. "How soon will it be here?" "The jack is at the blacksmith's, but it will take at least a quarter of an hour to arrive." 15 minutes, exclaimed the mayor as he watched the cart's wheels sinking in the mud. "We can't wait that long." "It can't be helped," said someone else in the crowd. "Listen," said Madeleine. "There's still room enough for a man to crawl under the wagon and lift it with his back. In half a minute we'll have the poor man out. Is there no one who has the strength and courage to do it? I'll give him 5 gold coins." No one stirred in the crowd. 10 gold coins, said the mayor. The bystanders dropped their eyes. One of them muttered, "A man would have to be awfully strong, and even then he'd risk getting crushed." "Come, someone, anyone," said Madeleine. 20 gold coins. The same silence. "It's not that they aren't willing," said a voice. The mayor spun around and saw Javert, who continued to speak. "But they don't have the strength. You'd need a terribly strong man to raise a cart like that on his back." Then Javert looked the mayor in the eye and said, "I've known only one man capable of doing that." Madeleine shuddered. "He was a convict on the prison ships at Toulon." Javert said this casually, but he never took his eyes off the mayor. Madeleine turned pale. Meanwhile, the cart continued to sink in the mud. "I'm dying!" screamed Fauchelevent. "Will no one help me?" With Javert's eyes still on him, the mayor looked at the peasants who stood there watching and smiled sadly. Then he fell on his knees, and before the crowd could stop him, he was under the cart. There was an awful moment of silence as the mayor tried in vain to lift the cart. Then the victim himself called out a warning. "Stop!" cried Fauchelevent, "or you will be crushed to death with me."